A reading from the Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 1, beginning at verse 13. God did not make death, and he does not delight in the death of the living. For he created all things that they might exist. The generative forces of the world are wholesome, and there is no destructive poison in them, and the dominion of Hades is not on earth. For righteousness is immortal. For God created us for incorruption and made us in the image of his own eternity. But through the devil's envy, death entered the world, and those who belong to his company experience it. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. And a reading from the Gospel according to St. Mark, chapter 5, beginning at verse 21. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered round him, and he was by the lake. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue named Jairus came, and when he saw him, fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live." So he went with him. And a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, for she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he had entered, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. Then he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was 12 years of age. At this, they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of all our hearts be now and always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. The book of Ecclesiastes says that there is an appropriate time for every matter. There is a time to mourn and a time to laugh. I'm sure when you were growing up, you would sometimes drive your parents to distraction by inappropriate laughter at the worst possible times. It might have been at concerts, school programs, church, even funerals. Those kind of things sometimes bring out our nervous giggles. The Gospel of Mark tells a story that gets the time for tears and the time for laughter all mixed up. In today's Gospel story, there are two tales told together, yet making one narrative. Mark begins one story, breaks in with another, and then completes the first. So it is a tale within a tale. It is a kind of narrative sandwich made out of two stories woven together. It begins with a desperate father, a leader of the synagogue, pleading with Jesus to come and heal his critically ill daughter. It is no laughing matter. And then the story is interrupted by this encounter between Jesus and a woman who has been ill for 12 years with chronic bleeding. In the midst of 100 grasping hands, Jesus feels a powerful connection with one hand. The woman believed that if she could just but touch his cloak, she would be healed. With everyone's hands out, Jesus asks, "Who touched me?" And in effect, the disciples respond, "What do you mean, who touched you? Everyone has got their hands on you." They don't laugh out loud, but they don't take him seriously either. In spite of their disbelieving comments, Jesus heals the faithful woman. And then some mourners come from the home to tell this father that his daughter has died. So now there's no point in having Jesus come to heal her. But still, Jesus goes to the house, and when he tells the crowd that she is not dead but sleeping, they laugh at him. Right there in front of everyone, the mourners laugh in his face. These mourners are not the first to scoff at what God is doing. Remember how old Abraham and Sarah, each in turn, laughed when they heard God promise that they would bear a son and become the forebears of a great multitude. They had to laugh because that promise was impossible from a human point of view. And so these mourners don't take Jesus seriously either. And why should they? They know about death. Death is an all too frequent and unwelcome intruder in the homes of the old and the young. The little girl is dead. What can Jesus do about death? But with God, all things are possible, and God is about to prove them wrong. In spite of the ridicule, Jesus goes to the house and restores the little girl to life. And so the top and bottom of the narrative sandwich is the story of the little girl. And inside that is the story of the healing of the woman with the hemorrhage, who has tried every cure but found no relief until she meets Jesus. At first glance, we might think that these two stories are unrelated, until Mark adds at the end of the passage a kind of afterthought. The little girl was 12 years old. And suddenly we see something more is going on here than two stories simply sandwiched together. Remember, we were also told that the woman had been sick for 12 years. So we begin to look for other connections. Jesus addresses the woman as daughter, and then he heals the daughter of Jairus. Two needy outsiders become daughters of God. Both the woman and the father of the little girl take Jesus seriously. Both believe that Jesus can restore their lives. They kneel before him. The number 12, of course, is representative of the 12 tribes of Israel. And this interwoven story clues us in that Jesus is on the loose in the world with divine power to restore life and abundant life for everyone. At the end, those who doubted and those who laughed are left speechless in amazement. Two very different kinds of people were healed that day. Firstly, the daughter of Jairus. Jairus was probably not rich, but he had considerable status within the community. In a society heavily influenced by issues of honour and shame, Jairus held a highly honourable position. On the other hand, there was this woman with a hemorrhage. She would have been a social outcast and deemed unclean according to Jewish purity laws. Her reaching out and touching Jesus didn't just heal her physically, but it restored her place once again in the community. Jesus responds by calling the woman daughter, the only use of this word by Jesus in Mark's Gospel. So Jairus has his daughter, and now Jesus claims the poor destitute woman as his daughter. Mark awakens us to the abundant healing grace of God. In Jesus, there is hope, there is life, and there is also community for all. Meanwhile, we tend to let the gospel out in dribs and drabs. We are stingy with what God so lavishly gives. We worry about who deserves our help, our food, our time, our money, and even our attention. And we carefully calculate the conditions under which we will stoop to forgive someone. In some cases, the gospel that is preached today is a far cry from what we read in the biblical gospel accounts. We have domesticated and tamed the message of Christ to suit ourselves and our own prejudices. When we experience the abundance of God's grace, we can't pick and choose as to who we think is deserving of our help and compassion. In Jesus, God has a way of transforming our dismissive laughter into tears of joy, our skepticism into speechless amazement. The gospel is full of promises that become our own when we take Jesus seriously and reach out in faith to the world. Amen.